1529. The gates of Europe trembled. 150,000 Ottoman soldiers marched toward Vienna, the heart of Christendom, outnumbered and outmatched. Just 20,000 defenders stood between Europe and conquest. This is the story of the siege that changed history. In the fall of 1529, the entire future of Europe hinged on the fate of one city. A massive empire, boasting a force of 100,000 soldiers, advanced from the east. Their banners, black as thunderclouds, struck fear into the hearts of many. Their cannons shook the very ground beneath their feet. They had already toppled kingdoms, reduced cities to ashes, and decimated armies. Now they were marching relentlessly toward Vienna, the very heart of Christendom. If Vienna were to fall, Germany, Italy, and indeed Europe, as it was known, would cease to exist. But within the city's walls stood farmers, artisans, and soldiers, all prepared to meet the looming storm head-on. And within that storm, the course of the world would be forever altered. The road to Vienna had its beginnings 3 years prior, in 1526. It didn't begin with triumph, but rather with utter catastrophe. On the plains of the Kingdom of Hungary, near a small town called Mohács, located in what is now modern-day Hungary, two armies stood poised for battle beneath the heavy summer skies. On one side stood the proud, yet waning, Hungarian kingdom, knights in shining armour, their banners emblazoned with images of saints, held a fervent belief that God would protect them. On the other side loomed the unstoppable war machine of the Ottoman Empire. Tens of thousands of soldiers, trained from childhood to obey orders without question, to fight with unwavering ferocity, and to achieve victory at any cost. The battle itself lasted a mere 2 hours. By the time the rain began to fall, it was already decided. The Hungarian army had been utterly annihilated, cut down mercilessly, scattered to the winds, and drowned in the marshlands of the Danube plain. Their king, Louis II of Hungary, barely 20 years of age, perished while attempting to escape across a flooded stream. His crown was discovered days later, mired in the mud. That moment was pivotal, a turning point that irrevocably changed the course of history. Hungary vanished as a kingdom, and a vast gateway into the heart of Central Europe was thrust wide open. From the east, the Ottoman Empire surged forward like an unstoppable tide. Its ruler, Suleiman the Magnificent, young, self-assured, and already a figure of legend, had already seized Belgrade, the present-day capital of Serbia. He had crushed the Knights of Rhodes, the Greek island fortress once guarded by the Order of St. John, and now reigned over an empire that stretched from the scorching deserts of Arabia to the rugged mountains of the Balkans. To Suleiman, Vienna held far more significance than simply being another city. It was the linchpin of Europe, the crucial bridge between East and West, between Islam and Christendom, and between rival empires. Suleiman firmly believed that destiny was beckoning him. If he could successfully capture Vienna, the rest of Europe might well crumble piece by piece. And so he began to formulate his grand plan. To the west, the reaction was one of sheer panic. The Habsburg family, the influential Austrian royal dynasty, clearly recognized the impending danger. Emperor Charles V ruled over a vast domain stretching from Spain all the way to the New World. However, he was far removed from the immediate threat. In Vienna, his brother Ferdinand faced the daunting, seemingly insurmountable task of defending the city with the meager resources at his disposal. Letters were dispatched across the continent, urgent messages of desperation sealed with wax and fueled by fear. Some pleaded for soldiers, others for gold, and many simply for divine intervention through prayers. Priests issued stern warnings to their congregations, urging them to repent. Nobles whispered about the approaching end of days. Merchants hastily packed up their goods and fled westward, seeking refuge. The world seemed to collectively hold its breath. For the first time, it appeared as though the very centre of Christendom might be on the verge of collapse. Meanwhile, back in Istanbul, the forges roared relentlessly. Cannons were being cast, horses were being shoed, and grain was being stockpiled in towering mountains of sacks. The army massed in ranks that seemed to stretch on endlessly. 60,000 janissaries, the elite infantry of the Ottoman army, clad in their distinctive white uniforms, stood alongside 50,000 armoured sipahi, the empire's fearsome heavy cavalry. Behind them marched engineers, sappers, cooks, and craftsmen. A veritable city on the move, comprised of more than 100,000 souls. Even the Sultan's personal servants and gardeners were in tow, for the Ottomans carried their entire world with them, wherever they went. And when the snows of winter finally melted in the spring of 1529, Suleiman issued the fateful order. Drums echoed through the streets of Istanbul. The mighty army commenced its march northward across the Balkans, heading directly for the heart of Europe. Their destination was unmistakably clear. Their purpose was devastatingly simple. They were coming for Vienna. When the Ottoman army commenced its march in the spring of 1529, the ground remained saturated from the melting snow, originating from Istanbul. The lengthy procession of men and animals extended for miles, their armour gleaming, banners snapping in the brisk wind, and the steady rhythm of war drums reverberating through the valleys. It was far more than a mere army. It was a moving empire. Following the soldiers were blacksmiths, cooks, engineers, and throngs of camp followers, including families, merchants, and even musicians. Each division was responsible for carrying its own supplies. Suleiman understood that conquering Europe would require more than just soldiers. It would demand order and logistical prowess. However, the very land itself seemed to resist his advance. Spring rains transformed roads into veritable rivers of mud. Wagons became mired up to their axles. Oxen perished while attempting to haul the massive bronze cannons through the flooded plains. Men lost their footing, stumbled, and vanished into the mire. By the time the army successfully crossed the Balkans, hundreds of horses had died, and many of the colossal cannons had to be abandoned in the swamps. Still, they pressed onward through Bulgaria and into Hungary, moving like a dark shadow that consumed the landscape. Villages were deserted in their wake. Smoke billowed from farmhouses, whether out of fear or deliberate arson. No force could withstand such a juggernaut. No king, no army, no wall could hope to stand in its path. Suleiman rode at the forefront of his host, calm and resolute. He wore simple armour of dark steel, but his banner, a golden crescent emblazoned on scarlet silk, shone brightly above all others. Beside him rode his viziers, generals hardened by years of relentless conquest. They carried maps, reports, and lists of towns already destined to fall. As the army ventured deeper into the heart of Central Europe, the weather deteriorated. Cold rain lashed the columns. Rivers overflowed their banks. Provisions rotted in their carts. Even the mighty Ottoman war machine began to slow down, bogged down by the very same mud that had swallowed Hungary's defenders 3 years prior. At night, the soldiers built enormous fires along the banks of the Danube River. Their drums beat softly against the backdrop of the rain, and their prayers mingled with the wind. They were no longer merely marching. They were enduring. In Vienna, news of the impending invasion spread like wildfire. Scouts reported villages being burned and bridges being destroyed. The people of the city worked tirelessly, day and night, to prepare for the siege. Walls were reinforced, gates strengthened with iron, and moats cleared. Barrels of gunpowder were strategically placed. Every able-bodied man was summoned to defend the walls. Within the city, panic and faith battled for dominance in every heart. Churches were overflowing with worshippers, as were the armories. Women and children carried stones to the ramparts. Priests walked along the walls, holding crucifixes high, blessing every cannon. Everyone knew that a storm was coming, unlike anything Europe had witnessed since the days of the Roman Empire. Within the walls of Vienna, the city braced itself for the onslaught. No one knew precisely when the Ottomans would arrive, only that their arrival was inevitable. Every sound in the distance could have been either thunder or the ominous beat of drums. The man in command was Count Nicholas von Salm, a seasoned general nearing the age of 70. His face bore the lines etched by decades of warfare, yet his mind remained as sharp as any sword. Alongside him stood Wilhelm von Roggendorf, another veteran of the Habsburg campaigns. Together, they commanded a mere 20,000 defenders, consisting of soldiers, townsmen, and foreign volunteers, against an enemy force 5 times their size. Vienna's fortifications were antiquated, designed for an era before the advent of cannons. Therefore, the people transformed their city into a fortress. Earth was excavated from gardens and piled into new ramparts. Stone houses were torn down to reinforce the walls. Every church bell was melted down and recast into bullets. Women carried baskets of dirt. Children hauled stones. Priests blessed the barricades. By early autumn, the city itself seemed to have become a single, living, breathing defender. Food was rationed carefully. Wells were cleaned and secured. Every tower had its watchman, every gate its guard. At night, the citizens slept in their armor, fully aware that once the siege commenced, no outside assistance would be forthcoming. The nearest relief army was weeks away in Germany, and the roads would soon be cut off by Ottoman scouts. Beyond the walls, the horizon glowed red from the burning villages. Refugees streamed into the city. Farmers, monks, and peasants, carrying whatever meager possessions they could salvage. The gates were finally closed behind the last of them. From that moment forward, Vienna stood alone. Then, one grey morning in late September, the hills began to stir. The first Ottoman vanguard appeared. Lines of cavalry cresting the ridges, their armour shimmering like scales in the dim light. Behind them came the endless columns of infantry, siege, guns, dragged by oxen, and banners are fluttering in the cold wind. The air vibrated with the rhythm of their drums. The defenders on the walls could see the golden tents of the Sultan, rising like a city of silk in the valley below. It was a sight both magnificent and terrifying. The might of the East arrayed against the very heart of Europe. Count Salm stood atop the ramparts, his cloak billowing in the wind. "Let them come," he said quietly. "This city is not made of stone, it is made of men." And as the sun dipped behind the western towers, the first cannon roared. The Siege of Vienna had officially begun. The first cannon shot struck the city like a thunderbolt. Stones shattered, windows cracked, and the people of Vienna realized with stark clarity that the storm they had long feared was finally upon them. Day after day, the Ottoman artillery thundered relentlessly. Their massive guns, some weighing as much as 10 tons, hurled iron balls against the walls. Each impact sent tremors through the ground, dust billowing through the air, and fear gripping every heart. Yet, when the smoke cleared, the defenders were still there, covered in soot, bleeding, but very much alive. The Janissaries, the Sultan's elite infantry, dug trenches ever closer to the walls, crawling through mud and rain under constant fire. The Sipahi cavalry circled the city, severing every road and extinguishing every hope of escape. Behind them, engineers toiled tirelessly, constructing bridges, siege towers, and tunnels beneath the earth to plant barrels of gunpowder. Their intention was to break Vienna from both above and below. Inside the city, life devolved into a relentless rhythm of thunder and prayer. The people slept in their armour, ate in the shadows, and fought amidst the ruins. When a wall cracked, they filled it with earth. When a gate splintered, they braced it with beams torn from their own homes. Women carried stones to the ramparts. Children brought water to the wounded. The bells of Vienna were silent now, every one of them having been melted down and recast into cannonballs. The defenders fought with desperate courage. At night, they slipped through secret tunnels and launched attacks on the Ottoman camps, setting fires and stealing gunpowder. More than once, they discovered entire mine shafts, tunnels packed with explosives, dug beneath the city, braving the darkness. They flooded these tunnels before the fuses could be lit. Each time they succeeded, the ground shook and another disaster was narrowly averted. The siege dragged on through cold rain and endless smoke. Thousands perished on both sides, not only from battle wounds but also from hunger and disease. The stench of death hung heavy over the camps like a suffocating fog. Even the mighty Ottoman army began to suffer. Their supplies dwindled, horses starved, men collapsed in the mud, their armour rusting where they lay. And yet, the drums never ceased their relentless beat. Every dawn brought fresh attacks. Waves of Janissaries rushing the walls with ladders and torches. They came shouting the name of God, and they fell by the hundreds under gunfire and arrows. For every one that fell, another immediately took his place. But Vienna held firm. The city bled, burned, and trembled. But it did not fall. Then, one night in early October, a powerful storm swept across the plains. Rain fell in torrents, flooding trenches and extinguishing fires. Tents collapsed. Cannons sank into the mud. The army that had arrived like an unstoppable tide now found itself drowning in its own flood. Suleiman watched from his pavilion, his face betraying no emotion. He had broken kingdoms before: Rhodes, Belgrade, Mohacs. But here, the stone would not yield. He gazed towards the city, where faint lights still flickered behind the battered walls. Vienna was wounded, but alive, and the Sultan knew it. By mid-October, the rain seemed to have no end. Cold winds swept across the plains, tearing at the tents and drenching the fires. What had begun as a proud invasion was now sinking into the mud. Within the Ottoman camp, disease spread faster than orders. Thousands of soldiers fell ill. Horses starved. Wagons broke down, and food turned rotten. The men were exhausted, wet, hungry, and half frozen. But the Sultan refused to retreat. He had come to crush Vienna, and pride would not allow him to turn back. The Janissaries pressed on with assault after assault. Their drums beat through the storm as they hurled ladders against the walls. Gunfire flashed in the darkness. Cannon fire thundered like the sky itself. For every breach they made, the defenders rebuilt it before dawn. Every night, the trenches filled with the dead. But still, they came within the city. The defenders fared little better. They had run out of food and powder, many were wounded, and every man on the walls had lost friends. But Count Nicholas von Salm refused to surrender. He walked the ramparts, even under fire, rallying his men. Vienna does not belong to the earth, he declared. It belongs to those who stand upon it. His courage kept the city alive. Each time the cannons roared, men found strength they didn't know they possessed. When one fell, another climbed to take his place. When the Janissaries breached the walls, the citizens themselves took up arms. Merchants with pikes, priests with swords, even women with boiling water and stones. The struggle became a chaotic melee. Men fought hand to hand among the ruins, slipping in the mud, choking on smoke. The air was a maelstrom of screams and steel. But in that chaos, the heart of Vienna burned brighter than ever. Then, one morning, the sky changed. The rain eased, and a pale sun broke through the clouds. Scouts returned with news. The first real hope in weeks. A relief army from Germany was marching south. They were still far away, but their banners had been sighted near the Danube. Suleiman heard the news, too. He stood silent in his tent for a long time. He knew that his men were dying faster than the walls were falling. The season was ending. Winter was coming to Europe, and no army could survive long in the cold without supplies. The Sultan ordered one final bombardment. A roar of fury that shook the earth. For 3 days, the cannons fired without rest. Then, as the sun set on the fourth morning, the great drums fell silent. In the misty dawn that followed, the people of Vienna looked from the walls and saw something they could hardly believe. The tents were being taken down, the fires were dying out. The army that had come to destroy them was leaving. Suleiman had ordered the retreat. The siege was over. He had not been defeated in battle, but rather by time, weather, and the unyielding will of a city that refused to die. When the smoke cleared and the last drumbeat faded, the fields around Vienna were silent. Where once 100,000 men had camped, there was now only mud, shattered wagons, and the broken banners of empire. The rain had washed away the footprints of the mightiest army on earth. Inside the city, the bells rang again for the first time in weeks. Men wept openly in the streets. Women prayed beside the walls they had helped to build. Children who had carried stones now carried flags. Vienna was scarred, burned, and half in ruins, but alive. The defenders had faced the greatest power of their age and had endured. They had stood against the Sultan who had never known defeat and had stopped him. The walls of Vienna had become the walls of Europe. For the Ottoman Empire, the retreat from Vienna cast a shadow over its glory. Suleiman the Magnificent returned to Istanbul, still a king, still a conqueror, but no longer invincible. He would fight again and win again, but the dream of conquering the West had begun to fade. The empire he led would endure for centuries more, but its peak had passed on the muddy fields of Vienna. For Europe, the victory became legend. Poets hailed it as a miracle, priests called it divine justice, and for generations, parents told their children that when the walls of Vienna held, all of Europe held with it. But beyond faith and pride, something deeper endured. The siege had demonstrated to the world that empires could bleed, that faith could unite strangers, and that courage could hold back even the tide of history. From that autumn of 1529, the balance of the world began to shift. The Ottomans would never again reach so far into the heart of Europe. Vienna would rise again, rebuilt, stronger than before, and across the centuries, the echo of that stand would be heard whenever people faced impossible odds and chose to fight anyway. Because sometimes, history is not written by those who conquer, but by those who refuse to fall.